Hello and welcome back to Summit Point for the third visit this season and week 10 of this video tutorial series with the global Mazda MX-5 Cup car for virtualracingschool.com. Once again we are using the small but challenging Jefferson course instead of the larger circuits, but this time in the reverse configuration. It's certainly an equally demanding layout in this direction, and feels almost like a completely different circuit altogether, with the braking into what is now turns 4 and 5. A very big challenge as you're required to slow the car whilst turning in over a bumpy surface. As normal, the lap that I've driven is with default afternoon weather with the iRacing baseline setup, and we'll play the lap through first in full before then going into further analysis. And across the line, so that was a 54.871. So if we take it back to the end of my outlap, you don't need to worry too much about having a super good exit here, because the start finish line, which is just here, is very close to turn 1 now with this direction. So you're braking pretty much at that green cone. You're turning in fairly shortly after braking, so you can't afford to brake too late, otherwise you'll miss the apex, which is very easily done. So if we slow it down, so yeah, braking exactly at that green cone pretty much. Braking in a straight line initially, not very hard though, that's only 30 or 40% brake pressure, and that's because I'm turning in quite soon after I've started braking. And in terms of the turn in reference, I guess the end of this pit lane entry in the normal layout is now the exit. You want to be turning in kind of as that ends, and you need to exercise a lot of patience here, especially at the apex. You can't afford to carry too much speed into the apex because the corner is a little bit off camber and it kind of falls away at the exit as well. And it's especially important to make sure that the car's nice and tight on the exit for a good exit. So the corner kind of opens up as well, so even though you have quite a long straight, you still apex fairly early. So we're still braking at this point, and we're actually opening the steering as well in anticipation of oversteer. We're kind of playing with, now we're finally turning in. So if we just take that out. So yeah, braking quite deep into this corner, keeping it nice and tight, hugging this inside curb but not making contact with the inside curb. That's quite important. And then as the car's now rotated nicely for me, I can get onto the throttle, and we're quite hard onto the throttle, and also we want to keep it inside this right hand lane on the exit, and ideally we want to make a secondary apex here. This is actually classified as turn 2, so we want to apex again for turn 2. We're still flat out at this point, so if I just pause it here, so yeah, once again we're nice and tight. We've made slight contact once again with this inside curb for the apex of 2, and that gives us a nice decent exit, decent run down hugging this curb on the left on the exit, keeping the steering nice and minimal, staying in the left-hand lane down towards turn 3. Now turn 3, the braking reference I use is quite subtle, but if you look about here into the distance, you can see the circuit just kind of very slightly kinks to the left, basically where my cursor is now, and I pretty much brake just after that point. So just after the circuit straightens out after this kink is when I brake down into third gear. And notice how I'm also using all of the circuit on the entry, at least on the brakes I am, and leaving the car reasonably wide, but we want to be turning in before we come alongside this access road here on the left. So once we reach this access road, we need to be away from the edge of the circuit and aiming for this apex on the right now. In terms of braking pressure, that's about 30-40% once again. You've got a nasty bump on the entry as well, so you need to be finished with your braking as you kind of roll over the top of that bump, so the car has a chance to settle for this apex into turn 3, and you're just kind of playing with the brakes slightly, but mostly you're just coasting. So it's quite a patience demanding corner, let's say. So off the brakes as I turn in, but then just to rotate the car a bit more, I get back on the brakes to just trail brake right there into the apex. I guess I must have sensed that I was running slightly wide, so I just breathed on the brake pedal just to get that extra rotation that I needed to hook up with this apex right here. So you see my brakes are on at this point. As soon as you've hooked up with that apex, you can get back on the power. Not quite slamming it to full throttle, a slight amount of progression there, depending on how the car is behaving. You'll probably notice that at this circuit, like with the normal layouts, the tyres drop off quite early on, and then they kind of fall off a lot slower, but you'll probably have to be a bit more conservative with the car after a couple of laps. So we're at full throttle now, just kind of playing with the wheel in anticipation of oversteer. You notice me seesawing at the wheel a lot around this circuit. It was the same with the standard layout as well. With all the bumps and camber changes, you can get oversteer quite suddenly, so I'm just kind of anticipating that as much as I can. And the car, the MX-5 generally kind of moves around a lot on the limit, so although I am actually trying to be fairly smooth, the car does like to move around a lot, so you need to be making those corrections, otherwise you'll get too sideways and out of shape. So for the exit here, using all of the circuit, I did drop a wheel off into this gravel many times. You want to try and avoid that, but it's not the end of the world if you do. I just brushed it there, and so now we're heading towards the braking for turn 4, which is actually the most difficult corner on the circuit, I would say, under braking, especially if you're right foot braking like I am. So I'm braking very, very gently, and I'm constantly fighting oversteer. So I'm constantly making corrections to the steering, to open the steering, to just allow the front end to settle a bit more, so it's not biting in and rotating the car too much. In terms of line, notice how on this particular lap I do a good job of going no wider than the middle of the circuit, which is obviously divided by these white painted lines. And as I'm turning in, so if we just take that back actually and watch it in slow motion, so I'm braking before I've reached this first apex of turn 4. So you have to hit the brakes just before there, but notice how I'm not braking very hard at all. That's like barely even 20%. If you brake any harder than that, you'll induce too much oversteer. You'll see how even there I've had to come off the brakes to allow for a little bit of oversteer. And also the circuit does open up again before turn 5, where it obviously tightens again. So you can allow the car to just open up a little bit. And I even briefly touched the throttle there, which wasn't a blip to change. It might have been, actually. Let me just have a look. No, so that let me just play that through. No, maybe I attempted to do a downshift, I'm not sure, but I had a blip which I guess was just to kind of settle some oversteer, because I didn't actually downshift in that moment, and I wasn't depressing the clutch either, so I guess I wasn't going for a downshift there. So it was just purely to try and balance the car. You can straighten the car slightly with a bit of maintenance throttle, I call it. So after that, I'm back on the brakes again, because the circuit's going to tighten very shortly. So again, not braking very hard, but just catching a bit of oversteer as the car continues to slow down on the entry. Now I'm finally off the brakes, and it's also worth me just saying there are several different lines that are going to work through turns 4 and 5. So obviously on this particular lap, I've used a fairly tight line on the brakes, mainly because the car's just over-rotating slightly. If the car's rotating less, you can end up a bit further wide. The most important thing, that is okay, the most important thing is to make sure that you do make it back to the apex for turn 5. That's super critical. If you miss that apex, then you will lose, guaranteed, a lot of time. So notice how I continue to make sure the car's nice and slowed. Finally I'm back on the throttle as I've got the car nice and tight, and it's a very late apex as well, primarily because the circuit doesn't quite tighten until quite late on, and notice how I do clip this apex just there. So that was a really nice line through the exit, and then through turns 6 and 7, it's only classified as 2 corners, but in reality it's kind of a series of S's. So you've got like a left, right, and then left again. You want to just kind of be really patient and accurate with your car positioning through this whole sequence. If you use too much curb, then the car can get really out of shape. So we'll just play that through. So up into third, and then modulating the throttle, just running over the curb, modulating the throttle again, down into second. I turned in a bit too early there, had to open up the steering before then committing to turning in fully for the last corner. So if we just slow that down once again. So I start turning in left now, and I take a big lift off the throttle, just kind of breathing in the throttle, and in terms of car positioning, using a decent amount of this curb, but I'm not over onto the grass. Obviously that's quite important. And the same again, I'm just bleeding out of the throttle as I take the curbs. So that's generally something that I would recommend always in any car, is when you are committed to attacking a curb, that you just come off the pedals. That way you aren't going to induce any more sort of oversteer or imbalance than is necessary. So if we just have a look at that, if I can find the right camera view, just bleeding, just feathering the throttle, and now we're braking for turn 7. Now, so I've said here turn 7 I was just a bit too early with my turn-in point, so you'll see I'm turning in now, but then I have to straighten and then turning in fully later on. So I guess my braking point was okay, perhaps a little bit conservative as well. I knew it was a good lap, so I didn't want to do anything silly like running wide and missing the apex. I just wanted to keep it nice and together. But yeah, so braking, in terms of a reference, I would say shortly after you've left this right-hand curb, you want to be on the brakes. But again, not braking very hard. You don't want to unsettle the car too much, and very soon after braking, you need to be turning in for the final corner. So we'll just see here, I'm on the brakes, I'm turning in now, but that's too tight. The line that I'm on currently is too tight. So what do? I open up the steering, and which isn't ideal, because at that point when I'm having to open the steering up, I'm under exploiting the grip available. So ideally you don't want to do that. You want to push your braking and your turning point slightly later. That way you can carry a bit more speed into the entry. So obviously gave up a bit of speed on the entry into the last corner. But the exit was good, which is much more important. You've got a decent length straight after this. And also I've got a very nice tight apex as well, which is more important than being too wide. It takes me a little bit of time to commit to full throttle. You're in second gear, reasonably traction limited out of such a slow corner, so just be careful with that, and try and anticipate any oversteer if you can with the steering, opening the steering as you get to full throttle. And then pretty much I just let the car run out directly towards the start finish line. I'm not worried about doing another lap. This is just a qualifying lap, so I choose the shortest distance. I mean, there's not a lot of time to be gained in that, probably a few thousandths, but it's the line of least resistance. So, and there we are. That is a lap around Jefferson reverse. So you can find all setups, replays and telemetry for your own use and analysis on virtualracingschool.com, where you can also book one-on-one tuition with top drivers from the likes of Coanda SimSport and Team Redline. Good luck for this week, and feel free to post any questions or comments below. Thanks for watching.